All right, conditions can be attached to the status
Right.
as part of really a democratically arrived at bargain, which is what happened in philanthropy.
Hmm.
Not unconstitutional conditions. Well, I
Right.
assume you would acknowledge.
Yeah,
Was it?
absolutely. But there are a lot of nonprofit organizations who are federally chartered and who basically lay out what they how they're supposed to be governed in federal law. And there's no reason that you don't have to you have to leave those things permanently untouched just because. And so to the obviously you don't want to impose coercive conditions that would violate the law, but to the extent that we're talking about law that's been passed by Congress, of course you can change that.
Right. Okay. But what about you can't violate I can't waive my First Amendment rights when I apply for and then maybe get C3 or C4 status, or what can be done there? I'm now just dragging you into the weeds, and this has come up, but you you, not they can't government can't run the place. That would ruin it. It's private money, which would be what would be said. Uh, where's the line? Where's the line? Can I do I have my free speech rights if I'm a C3? Uh,
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that my default would probably be to err on the side of, allowing people, entities, and groups to speak freely. I think especially in terms of advocacy in general, I think there are more difficult questions that come into account when we talk about financing and funding direct action type initiatives in many cases. And so there comes a point where, abstract advocacy becomes facilitation of violence. And I think in many situations you see public money from these foundations, especially on the progressive left, being used to support acts of violence in the streets. And so when things like that happen, I think to the extent that we would acknowledge that crime is not expressive, I think that's a reasonable starting place.
right. Is charity even before all the laws came up? Is charity my natural right? Do I have a natural right to exercise charity?
So I think we could draw a distinction here between a natural right to charity that we exercise in our individual capacities, such as through a church, through individual acts of service to our neighbors, through us coming together as individuals to help our communities, like we're seeing in North Carolina right now. And so in that sense, we have a natural right to act with charity. But do we have a natural right to tax exemptions? Absolutely not. And I think the framing of this as, we've got a right to this, we're collapsing two different levels of discourse, which is what we are as human beings and our natural rights versus those that are very clearly established by the law and conditioned and bounded by certain requirements. I mean, we wouldn't make arguments about the rights of a 501c4 to not be bound by the restrictions of a 501c4 or vice versa. These are simply compliance with the existing terms of what you must do in order to receive this exemption. And so to put it in terms of rights, I think is to just misstate the issue. The issue is, do you want to constrain your action in such a way that you can avail yourself of this benefit?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This might be the same question, John, but you said in the remarks, we remain, and I guess thereby you mean, I don't know if you mean conservatives. You can tell me. Here's the quote: "We remain trapped within the myth of the autonomous corporation, a corporation with natural rights to do mostly as it pleases." Then you say that you follow up by saying that because we do that, that means we're trying to govern with one hand behind our backs, one hand tied behind our backs. Uh, are we trapped in a myth about what philanthropy is, more largely even than charity? Is there a myth at
Yeah,
work
I
in
think
philanthropic?
absolutely. And this really registered for me a few years ago. I read a book called Winner Take All by Anand Giridharadas, and his book really makes clear that in many cases, what these big philanthropic organizations are doing is solving problems that the wealthiest donors behind them, in many cases, helped create. And so I think the myth of philanthropy, a big philanthropy, as we could talk about it in this context, is all private activity that is you can slap a social welfare label on is equally good. And that's simply not the case. In the same way that all forms of social behavior, we can't call those expressive. This is a problem with First Amendment doctrine as well, in that everything that we do obviously expresses something, but we have to draw a line when it comes to criminal and violent activity. We realize that, all expression cannot be protected by the First Amendment. All private activity that results in money going from one person to another outside of the normal business relationship context is not equally conducive to the common good. And so we passed laws because we were concerned with what is good for the public in a total a holistic sense, not just We want money flowing around from person to person outside the tax system. We have these categories of exemptions because we recognize that charitable giving for the public good serves the public good. And so if our philanthropic system is not achieving that, then it's perfectly reasonable to talk about reforming it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what would you exclude from your I'm now moving you into policy where you might be uncomfortable, and then you did not make policy recommendations in your remarks, but I guess you've already excluded crime, terrorism, or
Mhm.
now, by the way, there's laws against most of that already. Uh, you know what I mean? Wouldn't that be enough? But okay, do you throw on the revocation of an exemption if you engage in terrorism along with whatever other laws would be? What about the politicization? What policy contexts might be implicated by your thinking here? The politicization.
Yeah, and I think it should be fairly obvious, I think, to most reasonable people that much of the advocacy that comes out of a lot of the progressive philanthropic organizations, it is overwhelmingly dominated towards pushing the Democratic Party as a party in a particular direction. And I mean, when you talk to folks on the left, that they will basically acknowledge this. They talk about the groups as a collective, the groups, and the groups are all Democratic client groups who are getting money from the same cluster of foundations. And so that is so obvious to everybody who is involved in this space that I think you can reasonably ask the question that is this actually just partisan political activity here? And I think there is perfect if you did an investigation, you'd probably establish a lot of links here that this is not abstract advocacy for social welfare, and we really want anybody who is supportive of these causes to come on board. These are client groups of the Democratic Party, and they understand themselves in that kind of relationship. And so there is such politicization of this space in particular that I think that it's worth asking, are the terms even being followed of the existing law?
Now, the principle, though, that you're espousing here would apply across the board. If it's the case that whatever smaller ratio the other side is engaged in the same activity, they would be
Right,
out of luck
right.
too in the policy application of the principle.
Hmm.
And you're willing to take that deal, apparently, or you would be just as a thought experiment.
Yeah, I think that follows from the same Citizens United logic. I mean, obviously, Republicans benefit from a lot of corporate campaign contributions. That's not a secret. And to the extent that this potentially is sets us back, then what I'm concerned with in these remarks and in my conversation with you is just getting the principle right here. And I think the principle is that these things are downstream of democratic choices that we are made to serve the common good, and that whether or not that advantages or disadvantages some political party in terms of getting the question right isn't the paramount question.
Yeah. And in agreement with the principle, as you've described it, articulated it, as I think you may know, are an increasing number of progressive philanthropists who don't give one whit about the exemption. And
Hmm.
they're giving external to the whole nonprofit sector's legal structure.
Hmm.
They might agree with you. I mean, they do, or those who
Uh-huh.
decide to exit or go around or pay full freight, I guess, really for their politics and their uh, the giving that would not be considered exempt in application of the principle. Are you okay with that? You should look for allies on the progressive left that's also willing to do charity external to the current nonprofit legal structure.
Yeah, I think that's more principled than try to pretend that you're not a partisan actor when you are a partisan actor. If you have a lot of money and you want to give that to causes you believe in, go with God. But let's not pretend that this is a nonpartisan activity in many cases.
Right. Okay. Well, all right, John. I think that might be a good place to end. Is there anything I didn't ask or that you would like to add?
I don't think so. Just I would underscore the point that Congress, like big tech, in like Section 230, Congress has a big tendency towards set it and forget it policy making, and so oftentimes the regulatory frameworks and legal systems that are set up, they have kind of a dead hand effect, even after it has become very clear to everybody who's looking at this space that historical events have kind of indicated the need for this to change or to reform. And so, to the extent that the longer these things last, the more we start thinking of them as just natural rights, as you kind of mentioned. So, this kind of comes up every time we talk about reforming Section 230. People are like, you're going to kill the internet if you get rid of Section 230 by having liability shield reform for a lot of tech companies. And the tech companies act and litigate in ways that basically imply that they have this kind of natural right to a liability shield, which is crazy because Congress created this liability shield. And so the longer these issues are kind of left unaddressed, we lose a sense of thinking about these as things that Congress gave and Congress can take away depending on what serves the public good. And so I think having these conversations is really important because this is about how we shape the law going forward and from first principles.
Mhm. Well, John Ehrett, thanks so much for doing this with us. Totally appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.